The Fresh Toones music show is underwritten by the Animation Workshop at Animated Studio, providing animation instruction since 1993. Please visit their website at animatedstudio.com.
Thanks to the folks who led the way. Thanks to the folks, let us thank them every day.
Welcome to the Fresh Toones Show. My name is Dave Paltz, and today's show is dedicated to Women's History Month. And over the years, I've done these things called mini documentaries, and I've probably done 12 or more. Half of them are about women, and today I'm going to share about 5 or 6 of these mini documentaries that I put together and share them with you. You might ask, well, how is this connected to Fresh Toones? Well, Fresh Toones to me relate to any creative project that we share with other folks that are sincere and our best sides, hopefully. And I hope these mini docs that I'm going to share with you convey some of that. I'm not going to say too much about each documentary because I want to get in as many as I can today. But the first woman's story that I want to share with you today is Kitkala-sa. She was a Native American of the Sioux Dakota tribe. And it was around the turn of the century, around 1900, she really came to the forefront of being a recognized author and musician, and she was a strong political activist. So I'm not going to say too much more about it. Here's her story. Look up and see a new day dawning. Kitkala-sa was born on February 22nd, 1876, on the Yankton Indian Reservation. She spent her early childhood on the reservation with her mother, who was of Sioux Dakota heritage. When Kitkala was 8 years old, missionaries from the Whites Manual Labor Institute in Indiana came to the Yankton Reservation to recruit children for their boarding school. Kitkala-sa's older brother had recently returned from such a school, and her mother was hesitant to send her daughter away. Kitkala-sa, however, was eager to go. For children who had never been off the reservation, the school sounded like a magical place. The missionaries told stories about riding trains and picking red apples in large fields. After debating the decision, Kitkala-sa's mother agreed to let her go. She did not want her daughter to leave and did not trust the white strangers, but she feared the Dakota way of life was ending. There were no schools on the reservation, and she wanted her daughter to have an education. According to her autobiography, as soon as Kitkala-sa boarded the train, she regretted begging her mother to not let her go. She was about to spend years away from everything she knew. She did not know English, and tribal languages were banned at the school. She would be forced to give up her Dakota culture for a, quote, American one. Kitkala-sa's arrival at the school was traumatic. The children learned that everyone would get a haircut. In Dakota culture, the only people to get haircuts were cowards who had been captured by the enemy. Kitkala-sa resisted by hiding in an empty room. When the staff of the school found her underneath a bed, they dragged her out, tied her to a chair, and cut off her braids as she cried out loud. Later in life, she wrote that the staff of the school did not care about her feelings and treated the children like, quote, little animals. After a few years, the school granted Kitkala-sa permission to visit her mother during a school break. During the visit, her mother encouraged her to abandon school and stay at home. But she later wrote that visiting home made her sad. She returned to the school. Like many children, she may have felt that she no longer belonged on the reservation. Life at the school had changed her. In 1895, Kitkala-sa graduated and joined a teacher training program at Earlham College in Indiana, where she was one of the few indigenous students. She then transferred to the New England Conservatory of Music, where she studied the violin. By 1900, she was teaching music and speech at the Carlisle Indian School in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, one of the most famous boarding schools in the country. Kitkala-sa worked at the Carlisle School for less than 2 years. The experience reminded her of her traumatic education. She watched a new generation of young children arrive on trains and have their hair brutally cut. She began to question why the school required the children to give up their entire culture in exchange for an education. She saw the staff treat children cruelly and learned that the government paid the school for every child successfully removed from a reservation. She realized the schools were designed to erase her people's culture. Kitkala-sa channeled her frustration into a love for writing. She wrote about her personal experiences and the customs and the values she had learned from her mother. Soon her essays and short stories were published in national magazines like Atlantic Monthly and Harper's Monthly. In 1901, she published a compilation of her work in a book called Old Indian Legends. That same year, Kitkala-sa left the Carlisle School and returned to South Dakota. She took a job at the United States Bureau of Indian Affairs that supported her financially while she continued her true passion, writing stories that promoted Dakota culture and values. While working at the Bureau, Kitkala-sa met fellow employee Raymond Bonin. They were married in 1902 and had one son, whom they named Raymond. The family moved to Utah, where Kitkala-sa worked as a teacher. She did not teach at a boarding school, but at a school on the Ute Reservation where children lived at home. While teaching, she met William Hansen, a music professor at Brigham Young University. With William's help, Kitkala-sa combined her love of music and writing. She wrote The Sundance, an opera based on her essays. It was the first published opera written by a person indigenous to North America. Because many indigenous customs were passed down orally through music, Kitkala-sa believed it was a powerful way to share her family's value and reach a new audience. Kitkala-sa would spend the rest of her life trying to preserve the custom of the indigenous people of North America. Well, that was a very brief story about Kitkala-sa. I should tell you all that the documentary videos are up on YouTube at Dave's Fresh Toones, and that's Toones with two O's, not a U. And you can see a whole bunch of inspirational live documentaries that I made there. This next audio from one of my documentaries is about Dolores Huerta. She was a co-leader with Cesar Chavez of the United Farm Workers. Here's her story. Inspirational live show dedicated to Dolores Huerta. She was the co-founder of the United Farm Workers Association and worked closely with Cesar Chavez to get that going. She's one of the most influential labor activists in the 20th century and a leader of the Chicano civil rights movement. Dolores' mom had 2 jobs and was bringing up 3 kids on her own, and her name was Alicia, and she was a community activist, and she had a lot of compassion for fellow workers, and her daughter kind of picked up on that and influenced her a lot. And later on, after living through some other childhood experiences that weren't all that pleasant, she picked up on that activism that she saw her mom involved with. One of the influencing things was when Dolores was a student, she was kind of discriminated against by this teacher who didn't particularly like Hispanic students. And she accused Dolores of cheating because her papers were too well written for a Hispanic student. Well, Dolores took quite a bit of insult, and that probably stuck with her the rest of her life and fed into this activism and what she was going to do to change things. Dolores, who was a teacher in the 1950s, I can imagine her kind of leading her students in song. Well, being a teacher wasn't quite going to be enough for Dolores. She saw so many hungry farm children that were coming to the school, and she thought she could do more to help them by organizing the farm workers. In the early 60s, she met up with Cesar Chavez, and they shared an interest in organizing the farm workers. And that's when they started the National Farm Workers Association, which later turned into the United Farm Workers Union. Dolores Huerta was one of the most significant driving forces behind the nationwide table grape boycott in the late 1960s. which led to successful union contracts by 1970. In 1973, she led another consumer boycott of grapes that resulted in the groundbreaking California Agriculture Labor Relations Act of 1975. This allowed farm workers to form unions and bargain for better wages and conditions. There were certainly a number of tough years there, as you can see, from the early 1960s right up until the mid-70s, of trying to get some rights for the farm workers in better conditions. She was such a strong organizer for labor and worked at it for so many years. She certainly deserves more credit than she's already received. She had a lot of confidence that as long as they kept working at it, and it took many years for them to get the rights for the farm workers. As we're going down the road, we can still feel pretty good if we know we're doing the right thing, and if we stick with it, we can bring about some change. Well, Dolores experienced a lot of rough times in her life. She was on the platform with Robert F. Kennedy when he was assassinated, and fortunately she wasn't injured. However, she was injured some 20 years later when she was protesting against some of the actions of George H.W. Bush, and she was beaten up quite badly by a police officer with a baton, and it caused significantly internal injuries to her and several broken ribs, and the injuries required the removal of her spleen. And to this day, she is still recovering from those injuries. She's 93 years old now, in this year, 2023, and she still remains active, and she's the president of the Dolores Huerta Foundation. The primary purpose of the foundation is the furtherance of women's rights, LGBTQ rights, immigrant rights, labor rights, and civil rights. So she remains to this day invested in all those things. I guess Dolores in her long life is held to the belief that if there's a will, there's a way. Thanks so much for everything you did.
If there's a will, there is a way. There's a will, there is a way. If there's a will, there is a way. If there's a will, there is a way. If there's a will, there is a way.
Well, I'm so glad to have this opportunity on Rochester Free Radio to share the story of these women. The next story that I want to share with you is about Wangari Maathai. She was quite a fighter as an environmental activist in Africa, and she initiated the Green Belt movement there. And this was an effort to plant trees all the way across the northern part of Africa to try to beat back the desert, the Sahara Desert, that was eating more and more of the land and making a desert. She went across the number of countries that were along this belt line and got individual citizens to invest in planting trees. Here's her story. Today's inspirational live show is dedicated to Wangari Maathai. I came to know about Wangari 10, 12 years ago when I was working on a music video with some kids about famous women. Wangari actually introduced the idea of community-based tree planting. She was the founder of the Green Belt movement. She developed this idea into a broad-based grassroots organization whose main focus is poverty reduction and environmental conservation through tree planting. This woman just started in a very small process of gathering some people together and planting trees. And now that movement has grown into thousands of people, creating this green wall across Africa of 6,000 miles of planting trees and trying to hold back the Sahara Desert from just taking over the whole continent of Africa. Wangari Maathai, or I should say Professor Maathai, she received her doctorate in biological science, and She certainly planted a lot of seeds with love. One of her quotes is, "When we plant trees, we plant the seeds of peace and hope." Well, I should mention that Professor Maathai was from Kenya, and in 2004 she received the Nobel Peace Prize, which really brought her to the forefront of the environmental movement. I'm sure that she'd be out there fighting today, doing everything she could to make this planet green. Unfortunately, she died in 2011. And one of the things that she said was, "We cannot tire or give up. We owe it to the present and future generations of all species to rise up and walk." When she started out planting trees with her friends and neighbors, and people really didn't understand what she was trying to do. But she knew that sometimes you just have to do what you can do, and you can't think about a gigantic project when you start out. You start something as big as the Green Belt movement, and you start off small. You've got to really believe in what you're trying to do. And as you're working so hard at something, it'll feed back to you and give you love for the project that you're working on. Professor Maathai, who once said, "We can love ourselves by loving the earth." Well, I read something interesting the other day as I was doing some research on Professor Maathai, and it was about the Great Green Wall that's being built. It's a wall of trees across the whole 6,000 miles across Africa that's it's trying to prevent the expansion of the Sahara Desert that's really devastating the area. A lot of it's the effects of climate change, and it's been causing a lot of hunger and poverty for the people there. And this has created masses of people migrating to Europe to basically to escape starvation. Thank you to Professor Wangari Maathai and all the other folks that have helped to contribute to the environmental movement that's trying to limit the effects of climate change. Thank you. You're listening to the Fresh Toones Show on Rochester Free Radio. And today's show is dedicated to a number of women who have been important in history for Women's History Month here. And the next woman I want to recognize for her important contribution to history is Jane Goodall. Here's the audio to a mini documentary that I did in her honor. Today is one of my inspirational live shows, and it's dedicated to Jane Goodall. She spent most of her life in Central Africa, and she was studying chimpanzees and their social and family life. She kind of broke away from the traditional conventions of the time. She named the animals that she worked with in her studies. Usually the norm was to assign them numbers, and that's how they would follow up on the behavior of each individual primate. Jane said, "No, I'm not going to go along with the universal practice, and I'm going to give them names, and I'm going to get to know them and be part of the troop." I think it took about 22 months before they let her move up the caste system to be accepted into the troop. As a member of the chimpanzee troop, she found out that it's not only human beings who have personality, who are capable of rational thought and emotions like joy and sorrow. She also saw that they enjoyed hugging each other, kissing and pats on the back, and even tickling sometimes, which we kind of consider just a human activity. Her findings certainly suggested that similarities between humans and chimpanzees exist in more than just genes alone. Can be seen in emotion and intelligence and family and social relationships. So she made us aware of an awful lot that we were blind to up to that point in the 1960s. I'd like to share this quote of hers. "What you do makes a difference, and you have to decide what kind of difference you want to make." We might not be able to change the world, but we need to do what we feel is just, that is healthy for us, and just do it. Just do what you can do. I'm going to finish up with this last quote of hers. "The most important thing is to actually think about what you do, to become aware and actually think about the effect of what you do on the environment and on society. That's key, and that underlies everything else."
Thanks to the folks who led the way. Thanks to the folks, let us thank them every day.
Well, on this episode of Fresh Toones, dedicated to Women's History Month, I don't want to forget Malala. Most people know her story. Young girl from Pakistan that stood up to the Taliban and almost cost her life. But she's still out there promoting education for kids all around the world. For her, I wrote a song, and it's called Oh Malala.
Oh Malala, the girl who spoke when most said nothing. Oh Malala, the girl who shined a light on darkness. Braver than a fighter, brighter than a movie star, sweeter than a mountain raindrop. She spoke up so we can all learn, so one day we can become the love we earn. Oh Malala, the girl with the face that could change the forever. Oh Malala, they tried to kill you, but your love will never. Your love will never die. Reflected in your neighbor's eyes, living truth when others lie. Spoke up so we can all learn, so one day we can become the love we yearn. Oh Malala, the girl who learned and then she taught. Oh Malala, with gentle words is all she fought. Fought for the rights that some deemed all wrong. She wrote of truth when schools were bombed. She lived in fear but spoke her mind. Spoke up so we all can learn, so one day we can become the love we earn. Oh Malala, kind smile, gentle soul. Oh Malala, a gleam of silver, heart of gold. Oh Malala, kind smile, gentle soul.
The last woman I want to recognize today is Frances Perkins. She was the first woman to serve in the cabinet of a president, and that was under FDR, and she was recognized for establishing Social Security in the Fair Labor Act, which gave us minimum wage, 40-hour week, and unemployment insurance. So if you've ever had any contact with any of those, you can thank Frances Perkins for working really hard to get those done. Here's her story. Frances Perkins. A lot of folks, I'm sure, haven't ever heard her name, but she was the first woman appointed to the U.S. cabinet by FDR, and she was the labor secretary, and she really brought about some major changes. I first heard of Frances Perkins on a TV show on PBS, And then shortly after that, Elizabeth Warren, when she was still running for president, spoke about her on the late night show with Stephen Colbert. And this is what she had to say about Frances Perkins.
That story of the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire is a story of corruption. After that fire, the women got organized and they said, we're going to keep rallying, we're going to keep protesting, they're going to push from the outside. But Frances Perkins, who happened to be visiting and saw the fire, saw the women who jumped to their deaths, she said, I'm going to be on the other side. I'm going to be in government, and I'm going to lead the fight from there. And this is what happened. Over time, she goes to Albany in 1911 when women don't even have the vote. And she heads up a commission that investigates. They talk about fire safety, get changes, then move to rewriting the labor laws. The Great Depression hits. Franklin Roosevelt takes her to Washington. She becomes the first woman to serve in the cabinet of a president of the United States. And what does she do? She leads her part. She leads from the inside. Millions of people lead from the outside. And what happens? Well, she was a woman with a plan, and they got big structural change. That's when we got in America a minimum wage. That's when we got unemployment insurance. That's when we got Social Security in America. Shoot, that's when we actually got the weekend.
Frances Perkins was one of those people that felt like she didn't want to hear all the excuses of why we couldn't do the things that were right and fair to people. She just wanted to go out and do it. Sometimes it took a battle, but she did accomplish a lot. I'm sure she'd be out there today trying to bring folks to understand better the climate change crisis that we're under. With so many other things going on, she'd still say, well, don't forget about this one, folks, because this is a biggie. Well, I think Frances Perkins pretty much felt like enough of this dilly-dallying around. Let's just get to work. She joined FDR's cabinet to work inside to try to bring change about, but she certainly encouraged the folks on the outside that were protesting to give her some of the backing to try to push some of these major social changes through. I'd just like to mention once more some of the things that she accomplished and worked so hard for. She headed up the CCC, which was the Civilian Conservation Corps. She drafted the Social Security Act. She established unemployment benefits and welfare for the poorest through the Fair Labor Act. She established the first minimum wage and overtime laws, which defined the 40-hour week. I'm certain most people would have something on that long list of things she accomplished that they really appreciate today. Frances Perkins certainly had the will, and she accomplished a lot of things that people said she could never do. She took some pretty harsh treatment when she was the Secretary of Labor, but she fought for the American people, and she got some very important things that have made our lives easier. And that's it for today's Fresh Toones Show. I hope you learned some stuff about some important women in history. I hope you go out there and do what you can, and that you have a great week. So long now. Bye.
Thanks to the folks who led the way. Thanks to the folks, let us thank them every day.